The town was already riding toward his ranch before sunrise, and Ethan Caldwell didn't even know why. He stepped outside, boots hitting dust, shotgun low but ready, as 6 riders came through the morning fog. "That woman in your house," one of them spat. "She ain't who you think." Inside, Clara was setting the table like nothing was wrong, hands steady, eyes quiet. His little girl clung to her dress. "She's staying," Ellie whispered. Ethan felt something twist in his chest, because for the first time in years, that house felt alive. But the men outside weren't there to talk, and Clara wasn't running. Full story on my channel, she was packing her bags before sunrise, and no one in that house was breathing right. Clara Whitmore folded the last dress slow, like every second mattered, while outside, horses stamped in the dirt and men waited with hard eyes and harder stories. Ethan stood in the doorway, saying nothing, because part of him wanted her gone, and the other part knew the house would die again if she left. Then his son spoke for the first time in weeks, voice shaking. "If she goes, we go too." Clara froze. Ethan did too. Because suddenly, this wasn't about truth anymore. It was about what they were willing to lose. Full story on my channel. They said a house could die, long before the people inside it ever did. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe in justice that rides silent, hit like and follow. Now, back to the story. Ethan Caldwell's ranch sat a mile past the last fence line, where the wind didn't ask permission and the dust never settled. The boards of his house creaked like old bones, tired of holding memories no one spoke about anymore. It had been 14 months since his wife was laid beneath 6 feet of Wyoming earth, and in all that time, no laughter had crossed that threshold. Not once. His son, Noah, 10 years old but carrying the weight of a grown man, moved through the house like a shadow that didn't want to be seen. His daughter, Ellie, 6, had stopped asking questions. Children should ask questions. That's how you know they still believe the world makes sense. Ellie didn't. She sat by the window most mornings, watching the horizon like she was waiting for something that wasn't coming back. And Ethan, he worked. That's all he did. From sunup to sundown, he rode the land, fixed what was broken, and avoided what couldn't be fixed. The ranch survived. Barely. But the house was already gone. Meals were cold more often than not. Bread went stale on the table. The stove stayed quiet. It wasn't neglect. Not exactly. It was something worse. Silence that settled in too deep. The kind that makes a man forget what warmth feels like. Then one morning, just after dawn painted the sky in pale gold, there was a knock at the door. Not loud. Not desperate. Just steady. Ethan didn't get many visitors. Out here, people either had a reason or they stayed away. He opened the door with one hand still resting near his belt, habit more than fear. And there she stood, Clara Whitmore, dust on her boots, a small travel bag in her hand. Her dress simple, worn at the edges but clean. Her eyes, tired, but not broken. That was the first thing he noticed. Not her face, not her voice. Her eyes, like someone who had seen enough of the world to stop expecting anything from it. "I heard you might need a cook," she said. Her voice was soft, but it didn't bend. Ethan looked past her, out at the empty road stretching for miles. No wagon, no horse tied to the post. She had walked here. That told him more than any words could. "You alone?" he asked. She nodded once. No explanation. No story. Just truth, given plain. Inside, Ellie shifted on the wooden floor, peeking around the corner. Noah didn't move, but his eyes were already on the stranger. Watching. Measuring. Ethan hesitated. Not long. Just enough to remember what it felt like when the house still had a heartbeat. Then he stepped aside. "Kitchen's through there," he said. "You cook. That's all." Clara nodded again and walked past him without another word. No promise. No plea. Just quiet footsteps crossing into a house that had forgotten what it meant to feel like home. And somewhere deep in the wood, in the walls that had held too much silence for too long, something shifted. The first meal she cooked did not smell like survival. It smelled like something the house had forgotten. Bacon crisping slow in a cast iron pan, fresh bread warming near the fire, coffee strong enough to wake a man before it touched his lips. Ethan noticed it the moment he stepped inside, boots still dusted from the early ride. He stopped just past the doorway, not moving, not speaking. The air felt different. Warmer. Alive in a way that did not belong to this place anymore. Clara moved quietly between stove and table, sleeves rolled just enough to show work, not weakness. She did not rush. She did not ask where things were. She had already figured it out, like she had lived there longer than a single morning. Ellie was the first to sit at the table without being told. That alone was enough to make Ethan narrow his eyes. The girl had not come to the table willingly in months. Now she sat, hands folded, watching Clara like the world might start making sense again if she kept looking. Noah stayed back at first, leaning against the wall, arms crossed tight across his chest. He studied Clara the way a man twice his age would study a stranger walking onto his land. Careful, quiet, waiting for something to be wrong. Clara set the plates down one by one. No flourish, no announcement, just food, placed where it belonged. Eat while it is warm, she said, her voice steady, like it expected to be obeyed but did not demand it. Ellie reached first. A small bite, then another, and then something Ethan had not heard in over a year slipped out of her without warning. A laugh. Soft, quick, but real. Ethan's hand tightened slightly at his side. Noah pushed off the wall a moment later, slower, less certain. He sat down like he was testing something that might break. Took a bite, chewed, then paused. Not because it was bad, because it was not. His shoulders dropped just a little, like he had been holding something heavy for too long without knowing it. Ethan did not sit. He stayed where he was, watching, measuring, trying to understand what had just changed in a house that had refused to change for over a year. Clara finally looked at him, just once. No smile, no question, just a quiet acknowledgement, like she knew he was standing there and had decided it was not something that needed fixing. He stepped forward then, slow, boots creaking against the wooden floor. Sat at the table like it was unfamiliar ground. Took a bite. The food was simple, nothing fancy, but it was right. That was the only way to describe it. Right in a way that settled somewhere deeper than hunger. No one spoke for a while. The only sound was cutlery against plates and the faint crackle of firewood shifting in the stove. Outside, the wind kept moving across the open land like it always did, unchanged, indifferent. But inside, something had shifted its direction. And for the first time in a long while, the silence in that house did not feel empty. It felt like it was waiting. The house did not trust her yet, but the children did, and that was enough to change everything. It started small, the way all real changes do, quiet enough that a man could pretend not to notice if he wanted to. Clara did not ask for permission to fix what was broken. She simply did it. The loose hinge on the back door stopped squealing by noon. The cracked bowl that had sat untouched for months was replaced with something clean and whole. The floor, once layered with dust that no one claimed, began to show the grain of the wood again, like it remembered what it was meant to be. Ethan saw it all, said nothing. He spent that day riding the north fence line, checking posts that did not need checking, giving himself reasons to stay out longer than usual. But when he returned just before sunset, something felt different. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. Smoke curled steady from the chimney, thin and calm against the wide Wyoming sky. The kind of smoke that came from cooking, not just burning wood for heat. He stepped inside, slower this time. Less like a man entering his own home, more like someone stepping into a place that might not belong to him anymore. Noah was at the table again, not leaning against walls, not watching from corners. Sitting, a book open in front of him, though his eyes were not on the pages. They were on Clara. She stood by the stove, stirring something that filled the room with a smell richer than anything that house had held in over a year. Ellie sat on the floor near her feet, humming softly, a tune that did not quite belong to any song Ethan recognized. Clara glanced down once, then adjusted the hem of Ellie's dress where it had torn near the knee. The movement was small, careful, the kind of care that does not ask to be seen. Ethan felt it before he understood it. That quiet kind of care that had once lived in this house, and then did not. You do not have to stay inside all day, he said, his voice cutting through the room sharper than he intended. Clara did not turn around right away. She finished what she was doing, set the spoon aside, then faced him. I am not staying inside, she said simply. I am keeping it from falling apart. The words landed heavier than they should have. Not accusing, not defensive, just true. Noah looked between them, something uncertain in his expression, like he was watching a conversation that mattered more than he could explain. Ellie did not look up at all. She had taken Clara's hand without asking, small fingers wrapping around it like it had always been there. Ethan noticed that. He noticed everything. And for a moment, just a moment, he almost said something else. Something softer. But the habit of silence held stronger. He nodded once instead, like the exchange was finished, even though it was not. Outside, the light faded across the land, stretching long shadows over the fields and fences that marked what was his. Inside, the table was set again. 3 plates, then a 4th, placed without comment. Clara moved as if it was natural, as if she already knew her place at that table. And Ethan? He did not remove the plate. The first time he heard her sing, Ethan stopped breathing without realizing it. It was late, long after the lamps had been turned low and the fire burned down to quiet embers. The kind of night where the wind pressed soft against the walls and everything else held still, like the land itself was listening. Ethan had woken out of habit, not rest, his body trained to expect something missing. He reached for the side of the bed that had been empty for over a year, then pulled his hand back before the memory could settle. That was when he heard it. A voice. Soft. Steady. Not loud enough to carry through the whole house, but enough to reach him where he stood in the dark. He followed it without thinking, each step slow against the wooden floor, careful not to make a sound that would break whatever this was. The door to Ellie's room was half open. A thin line of warm light spilled into the hallway, cutting through the darkness like something alive. Ethan stopped just outside, his hand resting against the frame, but not pushing it further. Clara sat at the edge of the small bed, her back straight, her head slightly bowed. Ellie lay curled beneath a worn blanket, her small fingers wrapped loosely around Clara's sleeve like she might disappear if she let go. And Clara, she was singing. The melody was not one Ethan recognized. It did not belong to the churches in town or the songs sung around cattle fires. It was older than that. Slower, carried on a rhythm that felt like breathing instead of music. Each note settled into the room like it knew where it belonged. Ellie's eyes were already closed, her breathing even, peaceful in a way Ethan had not seen since before everything changed. Clara did not notice him at first. Or maybe she did, and chose not to show it. Her voice did not waver. It did not rise or fall for an audience. It stayed the same, like it was meant for one purpose only, to make sure the child in that bed felt safe enough to sleep. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Not sharp, not sudden, just a quiet pressure, like something long buried had started to move again. He had spent months teaching himself not to feel that, not to reach for what was gone, not to imagine that anything could replace it. And yet here it was, standing just beyond the door, in the sound of a voice that did not belong to his past, but somehow touched it anyway. Clara's hand moved gently over Ellie's hair, slow, steady, the kind of motion that did not come from obligation. It came from knowing, from having done it before. Ethan noticed that. The way her fingers paused at the same place each time, the way she adjusted the blanket without looking, the way she leaned just slightly closer when the song softened. This was not new to her. This was not something learned in a day. The song ended without a clear finish. It simply faded, like it understood it had done what it needed to do. Clara remained where she was for a moment longer, her hand still resting lightly against Ellie's shoulder. Then she exhaled, slow, almost silent, and turned her head just enough to see him standing there. Their eyes met in the dim light. No surprise, no apology, just recognition. Ethan did not step inside. He did not speak. He simply stood there, caught between the man he had become and the man who still remembered what it meant to hear a child fall asleep to a voice that promised they were not alone. And for the first time since that house had gone quiet, he did not walk away. By morning, Ethan told himself it meant nothing, but the house did not listen to him anymore. The sun came slow over the Wyoming horizon, stretching pale light across the fields and slipping through the thin curtains like it had somewhere to be. Ethan was already outside before the first rooster call, hands busy with work that did not need doing, fixing a latch that had held fine for years, checking water levels that had not changed overnight. He told himself it was routine, told himself it was easier out here, where things made sense. Wood broke. Fences leaned. Animals needed feeding. Simple. Inside was not simple anymore. Inside had started to feel different. When he finally stepped back through the door, the smell hit him first. Fresh bread again. Coffee already poured. The table set before he could even take his hat off. Clara moved through the kitchen like the morning belonged to her, quiet but certain, as if the rhythm of that house had always been waiting for her to find it. Noah was sitting closer to the table now, not all the way at the edge like he used to. His shoulders were not as tight. Not relaxed. Not yet, but not braced for something unseen either. Ellie. Ellie was talking. Not much. Just small things. Words about nothing important. But the sound of her voice carried across the room like something fragile that no one dared interrupt. Ethan sat down slower than usual, his eyes moving from one to the other. Clara placed a plate in front of him without asking, the same way she had the night before. No hesitation. No pause to see if it was welcome. She simply did it. He noticed the way Noah watched her hands. The way Ellie leaned closer when she passed by, like warmth followed her without needing to be explained. Ethan took a bite, more out of habit than hunger. It tasted the same as before. Right. That word again. It settled in him in a way he did not want to name. You have done this before, he said, his voice low, cutting through the quiet just enough to make both children look up. Clara did not stop what she was doing. She wiped her hands on a cloth, then met his gaze across the table. Yes, she said. That was all. No story. No explanation. Just a truth placed between them like something that did not belong to him to question. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her in a way that was no longer just caution. There was something else now. Something closer to understanding, or the need for it. Where, he asked. The word came out before he could stop it. Clara's eyes did not shift. Somewhere that does not matter anymore, she replied. The answer should have ended the conversation. It should have been enough to remind him that she was a stranger, that her past was none of his concern, that this arrangement was simple and temporary. But it did not feel simple anymore. Not when his children were watching her like she had always been there. Not when the house itself seemed to breathe differently with her inside it. Outside, a distant sound carried across the open land. Hoofbeats. Faint, but steady. Ethan's head turned instinctively toward the door, his body reacting before his thoughts could catch up. Clara did not move. Not at first. But something in her expression changed, just for a second. Not fear. Not exactly. Recognition. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but Ethan saw it. And in that moment, he understood one thing clearly. Whatever past Clara Whitmore had chosen not to speak about, it had just found its way to his front door. The riders did not slow down, not even when they saw the children through the window. The sound of hooves grew louder, steady and deliberate, cutting through the quiet morning like something that did not ask for permission. Ethan was already on his feet before the first shadow crossed the front fence. His chair scraped softly against the wooden floor, a small sound that carried weight in a room that had only just begun to feel whole again. Noah stood too, instinct more than instruction, placing himself slightly in front of Ellie without realizing it. The boy had learned that kind of movement somewhere between loss and silence. Clara remained where she was for a second longer, her hand resting lightly on the back of Ellie's chair. Not holding, not stopping, just there. Her eyes moved toward the door, not with fear, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had been expecting this moment since the first step she took onto this land. Ethan reached the door and opened it before the riders could knock. 6 men, dust-covered, travel-worn, but not lost. They sat their horses like they knew exactly where they were and why they had come. The man in front tipped his hat just enough to pass for politeness. "Morning," he said, his voice even measured. "We are looking for someone." Ethan did not step aside. He did not invite them in. "You found a ranch," he replied. "Not a town." The man's gaze shifted past him, just for a moment, catching the movement inside. Clara had stepped into view now, not hiding, not approaching, just standing where she could be seen if someone chose to look. The man noticed. Of course he did. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. "There she is," he said quietly. Not to Ethan. To the others. Clara did not move. Ellie's small hand found hers again, fingers curling tight this time. Noah's shoulders squared, the way boys do when they are not ready but decide to stand anyway. Ethan felt all of it without turning around. The weight of the room behind him. The space he was standing in front of. The line he had not known he would need to draw. "She works here," Ethan said, his voice steady, carrying just enough to make it clear the conversation would go through him. The man nodded once, like he had expected that answer. "That may be," he replied. "But where she came from, that is not finished business." The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the open land, lifting dust in slow spirals between horse and porch. No one reached for anything. No one raised their voice. But something in the air tightened, like the space between two storms that had not yet decided which one would break first. Clara finally stepped forward then, just enough to be seen clearly beside Ethan's shoulder. Not behind him. Not in front. Beside. "You should not have come here," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle, but carrying farther than the wind. The man studied her for a long second, then sighed, not frustrated, not angry, just tired. "We did not come to make trouble," he said. "We came to bring you back." Ellie's grip tightened. Noah did not move. Ethan did not step aside. And somewhere between the house that had started to feel alive again and the road that had brought these men to his door, a choice was beginning to take shape, quiet and heavy, with no place left to hide. The moment stretched, and no one moved, because everyone understood something was about to be decided without a single word raised. Ethan stood in the doorway, the frame of the house at his back, the open land in front of him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of both. The man on the horse watched him carefully, not with hostility, but with the patience of someone who believed time would eventually give him what he came for. "She does not belong here," the rider said, his tone calm, almost reasonable, like he was stating something simple and obvious. Ethan did not answer right away. He could feel Ellie's small hand clutching at Clara's dress behind him, the quiet tension in Noah's stance, the way the boy had stepped forward without being told. He had seen men hesitate in storms, in drought, in loss. This was different. This was a choice that would not fix anything broken, only reveal what mattered. "She is not something to be claimed," Ethan said finally, his voice low but steady, like it had settled into place without asking him first. The man tilted his head slightly, considering that. "No," he agreed. "But she made a promise." Clara's fingers tightened just a fraction at her side. Not enough for the others to notice. Enough for Ethan. He turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to see her in the corner of his vision. She was not looking at the riders anymore. She was looking at the ground between them, like the past had drawn a line she had already crossed once before. "Promises can change," Ethan said. The man on the horse shook his head slowly. "Not the kind she made." The wind shifted again, carrying the faint smell of dust and distance, the kind that reminded a man how far things could travel before catching up. Inside the house, something small broke the tension. Ellie's voice. Soft. Fragile. "She stays," the girl whispered, not to the men outside, not even to Ethan, but to Clara. Clara's breath caught just enough to be heard in the silence. Noah stepped forward then, one small step, but enough to place himself beside his sister, his eyes fixed on the riders with a quiet determination that did not belong to a child his age. Ethan felt it all. The pull of what stood behind him. The weight of what stood in front. The man on the horse sighed again, deeper this time, like the answer he had expected was not the one he received. "You do not understand what you are stepping into," he said, his voice softer now, not a warning, not quite. Something closer to regret. Ethan rested his hand against the doorframe, feeling the worn wood beneath his fingers, the same wood that had held years of silence, of absence, of things left unsaid. Then he stepped forward. Not far. Just enough to close the distance between himself and the edge of the porch. Enough to make it clear where he stood. "Maybe not," he said, "but I know what I am not stepping away from." The words settled into the space between them, quiet but final. Behind him, Clara did not move. She did not speak. But for the first time since the riders had arrived, she did not look like someone ready to leave. And out on the open land, where nothing ever stayed hidden for long, the balance had shifted, not with force, not with threat, but with something far harder to break. The silence did not break. It settled deeper, like the land itself was waiting to see who would move first. The man on the horse studied Ethan for a long moment, then let out a slow breath that carried more weight than his words ever had. "You think this is about taking her?" he said quietly. "It is not." Ethan did not respond. He stood where he was, steady, unmoved, but something in his eyes shifted just enough to show he was listening now, not just holding ground. The rider continued, his voice lower, meant more for truth than persuasion. "She left people behind. Not strangers. Family." The word hung in the air like dust that refused to settle. Behind Ethan, Clara closed her eyes for a brief second. Not in denial. In acknowledgement, Ellie tightened her hold on her dress, as if the word itself might take her away. Noah glanced back at Clara, confusion pulling at his expression, the kind that comes when a child realizes the world is bigger than what he understands. Ethan turned then, not fully, just enough to look at Clara directly for the first time since the men arrived. "Is that true?" he asked. His voice was not accusing. It was something harder. It needed the truth, whatever it was. Clara met his gaze, and for the first time since she stepped into that house, something in her composure shifted. Not broken, just exposed. "Yes," she said. No explanation followed. No defense. Just that one word, placed carefully between them. The wind moved again, brushing against the porch, carrying the faint creak of leather and saddle from the waiting riders. The man nodded once, like the answer had been expected all along. "They are not well without her," he added. "And she knows it." Clara's hand moved slightly, resting now against the edge of the table behind her, steadying herself against something unseen. Ethan watched her, not the riders, not the land her. He saw the way she stood, the way she did not step back, the way she did not step forward either, caught between something she had left and something she had begun to build. "Why did you leave?" Ethan asked. The question came softer this time, like it was meant only for her. Clara hesitated. Just a breath. Then another. "Because staying would have meant losing myself," she said. The words were quiet, but they carried farther than anything else that had been spoken. No anger, no blame, just truth that had been lived, not explained. The rider's expression did not change, but something in his posture eased, like he understood more than he had said. "And leaving," he replied gently, "meant they lost you." Ellie shook her head slightly, almost without realizing it, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We need her too." The words were simple, small, but they landed with a weight that none of the others could ignore. Ethan looked down at his daughter, then at his son, then back at Clara. The house behind him, the riders in front. Two truths, both real, neither simple. The man on the horse shifted in his saddle, not impatient, just aware that time was no longer something they could stretch forever. "She has to choose," he said. Not a demand, not a threat, just the shape of what this moment had always been leading toward. Clara drew in a slow breath, her eyes moving once across the room. The table, the fire, the children, then back to Ethan. And in that quiet space, where no one spoke and nothing moved, the weight of her choice finally began to take form. Clara did not answer right away, and in that silence, everyone else revealed who they truly were. The wind slowed, like even the land had leaned in to listen. Ethan did not move, but his eyes stayed on her, steady, not pushing, not pulling, just there, giving her the space to decide without being forced into it. That alone changed something. The rider waited, patient, hands resting loosely on the reins, not a man in a hurry, but not a man who would leave without an answer either. Behind Ethan, Ellie's grip tightened again, small fingers pressing into Clara's dress, like she could anchor her in place if she held on hard enough. Noah did not speak, but his jaw set firm, the quiet kind of resolve that did not come from age, but from knowing what it meant to lose something once already. Clara's eyes moved slowly across the room again, but this time they lingered longer. On the table, where 4 plates had been set without question. On the chair Ethan had not removed. On the window where morning light still filtered in, softer now, like it had settled into the space instead of just passing through it. Then her gaze returned to the door, to the riders, to the past that had not stopped following her, no matter how far she had walked. "If I go back," she said finally, her voice quiet but clear, "nothing changes." The rider tilted his head slightly. "It changes for them," he replied. Clara shook her head once, not in denial, but in understanding. "It delays it," she said. "That is not the same." The words were not sharp. They did not need to be. They carried the kind of truth that had already been lived through, not argued over. The man studied her for a long moment, then glanced past her into the house, taking in the small details that told a bigger story. The set table, the children, the way Ethan stood without stepping aside. When he looked back at Clara, something in his expression had shifted. Not agreement. Not quite. But something closer to acceptance of a truth he could not change. "You found something here," he said. Clara did not answer. She did not need to. Ellie's voice filled the space instead, soft but certain. "She found us." The simplicity of it settled deeper than anything else. Ethan felt it land somewhere he had kept guarded for too long. Not claimed, not spoken, but real all the same. The rider exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for just a moment before lifting again. "And they found you," he said, more to himself than anyone else. The other men shifted slightly in their saddles, not restless, just aware that the moment had moved beyond what they had come prepared for. This was no longer about taking someone back. It was about understanding whether she had already arrived somewhere else. Clara stepped forward then, just one step, enough to stand fully beside Ethan now, not behind him, not between anything. Just beside. "I will not go back," she said. No hesitation. No apology. The words were not loud, but they did not need to be. They carried through the air and settled where they needed to. The rider closed his eyes briefly, then nodded once, slow, deliberate. Not approval, not defeat, just acknowledgement. "Then we will tell them," he said quietly. "And they will have to learn to live without what they hoped would return." Clara's expression softened, not in relief, but in something heavier. Gratitude, maybe, or understanding. Ethan did not look at the riders again. He did not need to. The line had been drawn, not with force, but with something far harder to break. And as the men began to turn their horses, the dust rising soft beneath them, the house behind him did not feel like something fragile anymore. It felt like something chosen, something that had been empty and was not anymore. The riders did not look back, but the weight they left behind stayed in the air long after the dust settled. Ethan stood there for a moment, watching the empty stretch of land where they had been, as if something might return if he waited long enough. But nothing did. Just wind. Just distance. Just the quiet that always followed decisions that could not be undone. Behind him, the house did not move either. No sudden relief. No celebration. Just a stillness that felt different. Fuller somehow. Ethan turned slowly, stepping back inside, the door closing with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Clara had not moved far. She stood near the table, one hand resting lightly against the wood, like she needed to feel something solid beneath her. Ellie still held on to her, but not as tightly now. Her small fingers relaxed, like something inside her had finally settled. Noah stood a little straighter, not watching the door anymore, but looking at Clara like he was seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a stranger, but as someone who had chosen to stay. Ethan removed his hat, setting it down on the same hook he always used, the motion familiar, grounding. For a second, no one spoke. The kind of silence that does not press down, it holds. Clara finally exhaled, slow, like she had been carrying something heavier than anyone else in that room had realized. "They will not come back," she said quietly. It was not a question. Ethan nodded once. "No," he replied. Then after a brief pause, he added, "And neither will what you left." The words were not meant to hurt. They were simply true. Clara looked at him then, something searching in her eyes, like she was measuring whether he understood what that meant. Not just for her, but for him too. "You are certain about this?" she asked. Ethan glanced toward the window, where the light had shifted slightly, the day moving forward whether they were ready or not. "I have been certain about less," he said. It was not a strong answer, not a loud one, but it was honest. And that seemed to matter more. Ellie tugged gently at Clara's sleeve, drawing her attention downward. "You are staying, right?" she asked, her voice soft but steady, not afraid this time, just wanting to hear it said. Clara knelt slowly, bringing herself level with the child, her hand brushing lightly against Ellie's hair the same way it had the night before. "I am staying," she said. The words settled into the room like something that had been waiting to be spoken since the moment she first stepped through that door. Noah looked down at the table, then reached out and adjusted one of the plates slightly, a small, quiet action that did not need explanation. Ethan noticed. He noticed everything now. The way the space felt different. The way the air carried something warmer than before. The way the house, once hollow, now held something that could not be measured in walls or land. Clara stood again, her posture no longer caught between leaving and staying. It had settled. Chosen. And Ethan pulled out his chair and sat down at the table without a word. Not because he was hungry, but because for the first time in a long while, there was a place for him there that did not feel like an empty seat. The house did not change all at once, but it stopped feeling like it was waiting for something that would never return. Days passed, not marked by anything grand, just small moments that settled into place like they had always belonged there. Morning light came softer through the windows now, catching dust that no longer lingered as long. The stove stayed warm longer. The table was never empty. Ethan found himself inside more often than he had planned, standing in doorways without realizing he had stopped to listen. To voices. To movement. To something that no longer felt like silence pretending to be peace. Clara moved through it all without claiming any of it. She did not act like she had earned her place. She simply lived in it, steady, consistent, like she understood that belonging was not something you announced. It was something others decided, quietly, over time. Noah spoke more now. Not much, but enough. Short sentences. Small observations. Once, he even asked Clara how she knew when bread was ready without looking at it. She had smiled just slightly and said, "Because it tells you, if you listen." Ethan had watched that exchange from across the room. Something unreadable in his expression, like he was learning a language he had forgotten he knew. Ellie. Ellie no longer waited by the window. She followed Clara instead, small steps trailing behind her through the kitchen, through the doorway, out onto the porch where the late afternoon sun painted everything gold. She asked questions again. Not all of them answered. Not all of them needing to be. But the questions themselves were enough. One evening, as the sky stretched wide with color that only lasted a few minutes before fading, Ethan found himself sitting on the porch without work in his hands. No tools. No reason. Just sitting. Clara stepped out a moment later, wiping her hands on a cloth, the quiet rhythm of the house still clinging to her movements. She did not sit right away. She stood beside the post, looking out over the land the same way he did, but not for the same reasons. "You still expect them to come back?" she asked after a while. Ethan shook his head slowly. "No," he said. Then after a pause, "But I know how things have a way of circling back." Clara nodded, not disagreeing. "Not everything," she said softly. "Some things end where they should." The words hung between them, not heavy, not light. Just true. Ethan glanced at her then, really looked this time, not as a stranger who had stepped into his life, but as someone who had stayed when leaving would have been easier. "And this?" he asked quietly. Clara met his gaze, not guarded, not distant, just present. "This is not something I am running from," she said. "It is something I chose." Ethan let that settle, the kind of answer that did not need to be questioned, because it had already been proven in ways words could not match. Behind them, the door creaked open slightly, and Ellie's small voice drifted out, "Supper is ready." Ethan almost smiled. Not fully. Not yet. But enough that something shifted again, subtle and certain. He stood, brushing dust from his hands out of habit more than need, then paused, just for a second, looking back at the land that had once been all he had left. It looked the same. Endless. Quiet. Unchanging. But it did not feel the same anymore. Because when he turned back toward the house, he did not feel like he was leaving something behind. He felt like he was walking into something that had finally decided to stay. It was not the big moments that changed a life. It was the quiet ones no one thought to remember. The kind that slipped in between days and settled without asking permission. Winter began to lean over the land, not harsh yet, but enough to change the air, to carry a sharper edge through the mornings and a longer shadow across the evenings. Inside the house, the fire stayed lit more often now, not just for warmth, but because someone always remembered to tend it before it went cold. Ethan noticed that. He noticed everything, though he still spoke about very little. One afternoon, while the sky held that pale gray color that promised colder days ahead, he found Clara in the barn, not in the kitchen where she usually was, but standing near one of the stalls, brushing down a restless horse with slow, steady movements. The animal, once uneasy, had gone calm beneath her hands. Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching without announcing himself. "You do not just cook," he said after a moment. Clara did not startle. She finished the stroke of the brush, then rested her hand lightly against the horse's neck. "No," she replied. "I do what needs to be done." Ethan stepped further inside, the scent of hay and leather filling the space between them. "You always know what that is?" he asked. Clara glanced at him, not offended, not defensive, just thoughtful. "Not always," she said, "but I stay long enough to find out." The words lingered, simple but carrying something deeper than the question had asked. Ethan nodded once, slow, as if that answer had reached somewhere he had not expected. Later that evening, The wind picked up stronger than before, rattling softly against the windows, reminding the house that the season was changing whether they were ready or not. Inside, the table was set again, for plates, always for now, never questioned. Noah brought in extra wood without being told. Ellie placed the cups carefully, tongue pressed slightly against her lip in concentration. Clara moved between them, not directing, not correcting, just there, steady as always. Ethan sat down last. He looked at the table for a moment longer than usual, his eyes moving from one detail to the next. The bread, warm. The cups, filled. The chairs, no longer spaced like something was missing. He reached for his fork, then paused. "You never told me what kind of promise they meant," he said, his voice low, almost lost beneath the sound of the wind outside. Clara did not answer right away. She folded the cloth in her hands, setting it down with care before meeting his gaze. "It was not a promise to stay," she said. "It was a promise to carry something forward." Ethan frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in thought. "And you did not." Clara shook her head gently. "I did," she said. "Just not in the way they expected." The room fell quiet again, but not heavy, not uncertain, just still. Ellie reached for Clara's hand under the table without looking, like it had become as natural as breathing. Noah glanced at Ethan, then back down, as if waiting for something he could not name. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes resting on Clara a moment longer. Then he nodded once. Not questioning, not doubting, just accepting. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the walls, but inside, nothing shifted. Because whatever had once been missing had already found its place, not through force, not through demand, but through the quiet, steady choice to remain.